Executive Director of IRIS is Jason Owen-Smith. He is not only Executive Director, but one of the co-founders. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Michigan and also serves as Executive Director of Research Analytics. He is author, most recently, of the book published in 2018 titled Research Universities and the Public Good, Discovery for an Uncertain Future. Jay Walsh served for several years as the Vice President for Research at Northwestern University. Since May this year, if I have that correctly, he has served as the Vice President for Economic Development and Innovation at the University of Illinois System. And he recently spoke to a House Committee on Science regarding research funding, and he should have some good perspectives on this issue. So now I will throw it over to Jason, and thanks again for coming, and look forward to seeing your questions in chat.
Thanks very much, Dan, and welcome everybody. I'm pleased everybody's here. The order of battle right now, after Dan's introductions, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes of context for those of you who may not be familiar with IRIS and the data we work with, so that you'll understand where the information we're going to be sharing with you comes from. I'm going to turn it over to Jay, who will share his impressions of what the challenges are, both for institutions and also for making the case to Congress and the federal government about needs during COVID. And then we'll circle back and look at some initial data from 10 Irish universities, participating universities, and share what we're learning from that, and then turn to Q&A and a discussion of ways that we could expand and improve these kinds of reporting to be useful to universities individually and to the sector as a whole. So with that said, I'll skip over the roadmap since I just gave it to you. For those of you who don't know us, IRIS, the Institute for Research on Innovation and Science, is technically an IRB-approved data repository, which is housed at the University of Michigan. IRIS is the anchor for a consortium of right now 35 major research universities who collectively represent about 40% of academic R&D spending. And what those universities do, you can sort of see in this little graphic. Universities that join IRIS share administrative data drawn from their sponsored projects, HR, and procurement systems that track at a very fine level of detail direct cost expenditures out of federal and non-federal sponsored project grants. What that means is that for every grant that comes in, for universities that participate, we can see at a transaction level who's paid on the grants, what goods and services are purchased from vendors on the grants, and what subawards are made out of the grants to other performers. IRIS brings those data in, we clean it, integrate it, link it to a variety of data sources that I won't go into right now, but in detail, but that allow us to see a variety of things about the performance and dynamics of what you might call the US academic research enterprise. We then provide back to our university participants a set of reports that help them understand and explain what they do with research funding. And we de-identify the data and make it available to a broader research community to help us develop new knowledge that can inform what we're doing. What this platform does then, and this is sort of an example, is allow us to see for a given university when an award, say a new NSF award, flows into the university, the investigator uses the direct cost portions of that to tool up, hire students, staff, others, to buy the goods and services, whether they're research support kinds of services or survey consultations or reagents or glassware. They purchase the stuff they need to do the work. And sometimes they sub out to other universities, where if they're an IRIS member, we can see the jobs and the purchases and the subawards, et cetera, et cetera. So in an interest of trying to use this platform to, as quickly as possible, get a sense of what the early months of COVID were doing to academic research spending, we worked with 10 universities that are participating in IRIS that were willing to do a quick turnaround submission of data for the period from March through May of this year, which allowed us to use this platform to think about what is changing relative to data we have for these same universities for the prior year. This builds on our general suite of reporting, and I won't again go into a great deal of detail, but the data and linkages allow us to convey information about who's employed on grants, where the businesses that are part of the research supply chain are located, what industries they're in, when people who were trained in research leave the university to get jobs elsewhere, where they work and how much they earn on average, features of scientific teams, and features of academic careers. And so it's in this context that we wanted to use this platform and the existing pipeline for sharing data to pull together something that we don't think exists elsewhere and that we're increasingly hearing a need for, which is good, systematic, multi-university information about how the research enterprise is reacting to, and hopefully soon recovering from COVID, and what we might need to be able to make the case out into the world and to help inform decision-making on our campuses. And so that's the framework. We'll circle back and actually share the data with you, but having given you the sort of motorcycle maintenance version of what we do, I wanted to turn to Jay Walsh, who's been very active both in his administrative roles and also in working with AAU and other associations in efforts to help Congress understand the importance of research relief and of the research enterprise. And he's going to tell us a bit about his impressions of where we stand and give us some insight into how data might be useful. Thanks very much, Jay.
Jason, thank you. Look, we all know that in March, at universities and frankly businesses and the rest of the country, we all headed home for a while. And that impacted not just the teaching aspects of research, which we all nationwide recognize, but also it impacted the research that's done. By some estimates, something like 80% of all research was significantly slowed or stopped in April. Those faculty, grad students, postdocs remained productive, producing reports and manuscripts and writing proposals during that time period. But for a while that could go on, and then you run out of data to write up, and the productivity falls off. So there's a really significant sense that we need data on how that productivity changed during that time period. We're starting to get that in the sense that there were quite a few publications that were submitted and proposals that were submitted, but real data on this would help us understand the real impact of that shutdown in the spring on productivity within the research environment. Then in late spring and early summer, there was a slow return to research. Now, having said that, one of the things that we found when we've looked at across the country at the situation is there's been tremendous heterogeneity in at different universities, and the sort of percentage of shutdown there was. Certainly in the very hot spots in the spring, there was a lot more shutdown than in areas that had less COVID. And then there was also tremendous heterogeneity within fields, computational fields, for example. The folks could continue working, and in laboratory-based fields, that was a little more difficult. Much of that, candidly, is anecdotal. We don't have tremendous data on this, and that would be helpful for us as academic institutions and us as a nation to understand the the breadth of the impact in various fields. So in the late spring, we all started returning, at least within more essential areas, doing the things that are really required to do that safely, masking, social distancing, which in this case meant fewer people per lab area. And then, hygiene increases, symptom checking, that sort of thing. And by now, most labs, from what I can tell in conversations around the country with senior research officers at the major research universities, most laboratories are back and functional at some level. Although with social distancing, that is becoming challenging. A lot of interactions in laboratories occur in a sort of happenstance way. A grad student meets up with another grad student and talks about data. So there are questions of how productive that those laboratories are, given that the happenstance interactions are not happening. Again, we don't have data on this. We do know that there is still some significant impact on human subjects research. Essential human subjects research, so patients enrolled in cancer studies, largely continued unabated in the spring, although at some places in the country that even that type of human subjects work discontinued. Human subjects work in the social sciences area has dropped off substantially, and that's a difficult situation for those folks, and still continues to be significantly diminished. And again, these are anecdotal, and having more data would be really helpful. One of the things that we absolutely noticed was that core facilities were difficult their financial models were significantly strained. So a core facility, the original core facility was a library. We don't need all the books, all of us. So we put these core resources in one place called the library, and we share those. So there are lots of shared facilities at major research universities around the country. Microscopes and other large pieces of equipment that each of us as a researcher doesn't need personally in our lab. Those core facilities are generally funded via a mechanism where, as an investigator, I might get a grant and I might need to use 3 or 4 core facilities, and to use those facilities, I pay every time I use those facilities. When there's a shutdown or a slowdown, there are far fewer funds flowing to those core facilities. 80% of the cost of a core facility across a university is typically personnel. So those personnel, you need to maintain those people, otherwise you lose this infrastructure. And this is an important piece of infrastructure, not only for a university, but also for the nation to have this infrastructure. We have a sense of the loss of funds to those core facilities because the funds are no longer flowing from the grant to the core facility because they are not being used. But we don't have hard data on that, and that would be really helpful to have hard data on the impacts of those core facilities. The federal government helped a lot with an OMB circular that allowed funds flow to pay for people, but it would be good to have an understanding of the impact on grad students and postdocs. Are there a change in the number of those who are being supported? Are they being as fully supported as they were? Are they being recruited? Are they not being recruited anymore? Other data that would be good to know is, internal money from universities that was spent on supporting research in ways that grants couldn't support this. What were the costs of personal protective equipment? What were the costs of ramping down and ramping up? Are there new faculty starts? We've generally heard no, that there isn't a lot of hiring. And it would really be good to have some better sense of the heterogeneity. We have anecdotal evidence that, as I mentioned, computational work could continue, lab work couldn't, but it would be good to have a sense of how that impacted various different fields. You could dig into some of the physical sciences versus the engineering sciences versus the life sciences, and the social sciences. And without these data, funding agencies and universities are stuck making decisions based upon stories, which are important and are informative, but are not necessarily the whole picture. So a good source of data is absolutely necessary. Many folks around the universities, as well as the funding agencies, and on the Hill recognize this. And I'd love to have a further discussion about this. Jason, I'll throw this back to you. You're on mute, Jason.
It's COVID life. If I don't start talking at least once a day while I'm on mute, I start to twitch a little bit. So thank you very much, Jay. I really appreciate both the work you're doing and hearing the framework, and some of the context. So having set up sort of the context, both in terms of what IRIS does and in terms of the larger environment in which we are all working right now, at least those of us who are at universities and kindred organizations, what we've done is a first cut from a subset of universities, and I'll make these larger in a second, to give us some initial data. We focused on two things. The first is understanding what's happening to a particular part of the research spend. In this case, direct cost purchases of goods and services from vendors to support research. We use that, and actually the University of Michigan's using it right now for several purposes, but one of them is to provide a very rough back of the envelope calculation of how much of the research environment endeavor is kind of up and running, at least the funded research endeavor. We break that out by the source of funds, first very broadly into federal and non-federal fund buckets, because the OMB guidance that Jay mentioned covered federal funds, but often didn't extend to corporate or nonprofit funding. The second thing we look at is changes in the workforce. So particularly in the early months when we have this data now, we're working to extend it. What we see is that much of the salary payments, particularly out of federal sources, continued because of the guidance, at the same time that other expenses were going down, suggesting that work wasn't being done, but people were being paid. And we can break that out somewhat by agency to get a sense of it. And so that's the idea. All that happened here to make it happen was that the universities who decided to participate, and you can sort of see our 10 partners in this at the bottom, shared exactly the kind of data that they usually would with IRIS just a little bit earlier so that we could get a sense. We are collecting new data now that will allow us to update these figures and information, hopefully through September, very quickly. And part of what we'd love to hear in Q&A is some sense from you all. I've already heard some things from Jay about what might be useful to see in this, or what are sort of things that are particularly live in your worlds. So this is the first figure. And this, as I said, is total research spending from all externally funded sources for purchases from vendors. What this does is look at a particular month. This is the average across all of the participating universities of the change in this month relative to the same month in the prior year. And so what you're seeing here in this first thing is that January 2019 saw a 10% decline in this spending over January 2018. What we're particularly interested in here is the period from March, when most campuses started to shut down, through May. And what we see here is that in March, in part because the shutdowns happened a little bit unevenly over a several-week period, across the country. These universities, which are spread out geographically, were still, filling out their portfolio. But very quickly, we saw a pretty significant decline, down to a point where by May, these universities at least were spending almost 40% less of their research, externally funded research funds to conduct this kind of work than they were at the same time period in the prior year. What that means to us is that in a sort of very rough back of envelope terms, this suggests that about 60% of the work that could be done with these grants is getting done at the moment. And we know that's an imperfect thing. One of the things we're doing as we get more data is developing out questions about how this actually happens and what it might mean to see continuing declines from different sources. This is another way to view it. This looks not at percentage change, but at monthly expenditures across these universities from federal, the blue line, and non-federal sources. And what you see here is not surprising. What we see in many places, there's usually a ramp up in spending toward the end of summer as people come back onto campus and students return and work picks up. There's usually another ramp up at the beginning of the winter semester. And typically you see this kind of cyclical pattern, particularly for federal funding. But what you're seeing here is starting in March, in dollar terms, a real and consistent decline. And so as we continue to move out the data in a longer time frame and with more universities, we can start to do more to address the kinds of things Jay raised, which, for instance, look at how universities vary in this, whether institutions that are more focused in biomedical sciences or engineering have different patterns, whether it varies by agency. The reason we haven't broken that out so far was we felt that there was a need for high-level stylized facts, but also with only 10 universities participating, we were hesitant to show a lot of distributional work that might identify some of the individual universities with data, which is not something that we're allowed to do under our MOUs with our participating institutions. Non-federal funding doesn't have as much of the cyclical feel, but it does have a decline, though a relatively less steep one, which in dollar terms is largely because the base rate of non-federal spending is much lower. So that's spending, and it gives us a little sense. This is a similar way to think about change in employment. And so the way IRIS deals with this, when we receive data from a university, it includes information about each of the people who's paid on a particular grant in a given month. And we use across universities a set of tools that we've developed to take the job classifications of the people who are paid. So research assistant, postdoctoral fellow, associate professor, research specialist, senior, and classify them into broad categories. What we've done here is taken everybody who's employed on external research grants in the period March through May of 2020, so this quarter, and the period March to May of 2019, and we've constructed this rate of change measure. And so what this tells us is that, the all employees bar across the entire sweep of folks who were employed in federal and non-federal sponsored project funding, this quarter saw about 1% fewer people employed than last quarter. Now that's really good news. What that means is that with a combination of the work that universities have been doing, we believe with some of their institutional investments to protect staff people and faculty and students who are working, for instance, as Jay mentioned, at core facilities and things like that, and with the OMB and agency directives about salary, in the first months of the pandemic, we were very well able at these universities were able to very strongly protect their research workforce. Indeed, in this time period, postdocs and faculty paid on grants actually went up, which we're working to understand more fully, but we think is a function of shifting away at many universities from internally funded or institutionally funded salary payments toward federal funding. The key and interesting fact here, though, is that of these categories, the people who've taken the largest hit, at least in the early months, are students. What this means, we believe, is that not that people who were employed at these institutions in what at my institution we would call a full-term GSRA-ship, a salaried, stipended research position on a grant, but rather those people aren't losing their jobs as far as we can tell. But what we are seeing is that particularly as labs and field sites and in-person research and human subjects research declines, students at all levels, undergraduates, PhD students, master's students, who are employed more often in temporary roles, hourly, not stipended, are seeing a decline. And so it is not necessarily the core of the folks who are working on grants as students that are being hurt here. It's more the people who are using research employment on grants for the experience, for time in a lab, for fiscal support above and beyond a stipend or a fellowship. We wonder, and this is one of the things we're hoping to see as we expand, how this will continue in the most recent months as the guidance about salary from OMB expired on July 26th, I believe, of this year, which means that if spending and work continues to decline or to be flat, we would expect to start seeing declines in personnel. And we would expect those to come most immediately from folks like the temporary students that we're talking about, rather than from salaried full-term folks. There's also work to be done that we're starting in on now to understand individual university policies and the timing of their shutdowns as a way to add some nuance and to think about the variations. Finally, this just gives you a sense of numbers. So these numbers aren't large, or at least they're not huge, but they amount to a significant group. What this does is break out growth and decline in number of people employed on grants by agencies. And we're just looking at the top 5 federal funders of academic research on these campuses right now. And what we're seeing is that, not surprisingly, NIH, which is the largest single funder of research, also sees significant declines. But overall, the declines are primarily in students, again, with some in staff and postgraduate categories. And there's significant variation also across funders. Here too, as we get more data, breaking this down further by, for instance, ICs at NIH or directorates at NSF, or what we call sub-organizational units, which are typically schools and colleges within participating universities, could give us a sense. We also, based on some work we've been doing with single universities that I can't share here, have been doing some work to use what information we have to identify whether these are falling disparately on different demographic groups, early career faculty, female faculty, faculty in some fields or with some funders than others. So this is a down payment, we hope, in using the framework and the existing data pipeline at IRIS to develop out a thing that can be expanded with input from you all, from our members, and from the research community, hopefully to be a fairly routinely updated source of increasingly representative data for these very purposes. And so just to summarize, these are what we take to be the kind of large messages initially. But I think the biggest thing to say is that fresher data, data that we're collecting and cleaning now from our current tranche of submissions from members, will let us see more about what the effects of declining, of the end of the guidance about salary were, and what happens as universities that face ongoing budgetary challenges, as tuitions decline, as healthcare costs continue to go up, and particularly as the need to maintain the research infrastructure that is not being funded as much by indirect cost charges and reimbursements right now as it could be, starts to bite in a context of fiscal austerity. So this is not by any means comprehensive. It is a set of 10 universities. They're a mix geographically of public and private, large and small, different funding portfolios. But we are not at a point yet where we can say that this is representative of what's going on at all research university campuses. And one of our goals, if this looks valuable, is to expand as much as possible the range of data and the range of types of institutions that we can talk about, as well as the metrics that we might use to capture key information here. So some of the things we've mentioned, to give you a sense, one is looking more distributionally and at differences across universities to understand how this is affecting different types of campuses or differently focused campuses or campuses in different locations differently. One is to break down more the set of questions that surround what's happening with regard to what the NSF would call broadening participation efforts in science and engineering, where the goal is to recognize that current research coming out and anecdote suggests that faculty of color, female faculty, particularly those with caregiving responsibilities at home, either children or, elders, and folks at early career stages and working in laboratory, studio, or field environments seem to be having a greater difficulty with the effects of the pandemic than others. We know there are significant existing inequities in the research mission along these dimensions. We don't believe that COVID has created them, but we worry that it is exacerbating them in ways that will have effects potentially on the academic workforce and on science and technology education at all levels for quite a long time. The third thing that we are interested in looking at in more detail is to break out with greater detail and information what is actually still being purchased and what isn't, as a way to think about this key distinction that's very hard to make in academic data, in administrative data of this sort, but absolutely essential, between human subjects research, laboratory research, research that does both, many bioscience labs, research that is in a lab but doesn't do human subjects, for instance, chemistry, much chemistry. Breaking out more about the style of research based on the pattern of charges and funders offers another way to think about the diversity. And so those are the directions we're taking this as we work to expand the data, both the range in terms of time and its scope in terms of coverage. And as we're doing this, we're having conversations like this one, both to share the information we have and to get from you a sense of how it might be useful to improve it. And working with AAU and our university members and others, we're trying to get a sense of how to speed the process by which we go from data from universities to a reasonable near-ish to real-time update on information of value for their planning and decision-making and the conversations they're having. So I'll pause there, kick it back to Jay to see if he has any comments. And if not, I think we can open a little bit for Q&A. I was gonna conclude, and I'll just move along by saying that for those universities that participated, the aggregate data that we've been sharing with you was matched by a report that did the same sorts of tables and figures for their data relative to a benchmark made up of everyone else. And so this is one of the things, because of the privacy protections in our MOU, is a mock-up. It's synthetic data, so don't read much into it. The aggregate data is the same. The synthetic data is what you would see if you were an individual university getting a sense of where your information stood. And I'm happy to walk through those some more, but I wanted to have that out in the world as you're thinking about what might be useful and ways that this could have both internal uses on your campuses or in your institution, and also externally in communications. So I'll pause. Jay, if you want to add anything, or Dan, if Jay's good, we can move on to some Q&A.
Just 15 seconds worth of comments. I'm glad you mentioned the grad students and postdocs. There's quite a bit of concern about the impact that the pandemic is having on them. We have heard that there are some programs that are limiting their grad student recruitment the coming year. We do know that it's difficult for those who are graduating or those who are postdocs who are hoping to get faculty positions to move on. And you did mention the issue of disparities. You mentioned children. Those with children, it is quite difficult to work and also teach your school-age children at the same time. So that information is starting to come out. I could talk more, but I think we should go to questions, or Dan first, maybe.
Sure. We have a couple of questions about the definitions of research vendor. Can you define research vendor, and do we keep track of whether owners are minorities or women?
Mm-hmm. So in this case, we don't define the vendors a priori. What we do is look at every external purchase of something from a research grant. And so a vendor in this case is any organization that we see having a purchase associated with a federal or non-federal grant, and in part of procurement data that we retrieve from our universities. And so this captures everything from individuals who may be consulting on a project or a grant to large companies. For instance, I can't cite you a number, but Fisher Scientific shows up a lot in these data as a vendor, to smaller, more local companies. And one of the things that we're doing now pertaining to the second question is pursuing data linkage between these data, which we use in our standard reporting, and data at the US Census Bureau, and also some proprietary data that we source from Bureau Van Dyke's Orbis dataset, which lets us see characteristics of the vendors. Where are they located? What industries are they in? For the second question, are they female or minority owned? Are they public or private? Those kinds of questions.
So we had another question that you sort of touched on. Do you have a sense of any shifts in responsibility, for example, of student to staff responsibilities, like, for example, students participating in COVID testing?
Sadly, we don't have that sense yet. It's difficult at this point with these data to get down to what tasks people are actually doing. That's something we've been trying to crack. We can talk at an aggregate level, as I've shown before, about who we're losing from the pipeline and from the lab or the research team, and who we're keeping. And so, for instance, seeing a slight move of faculty members onto salary from grants in this time period, and a slight decline in staff may suggest that faculty are taking up more of the kinds of work that might have been done by staff. By the same token, a fairly significant decline in student participation in research is likely to leave more tasks, particularly in conditions where labs are reopened at lower than full density, on professional staff or faculty or postdocs. And so getting toward that is important. it is unlikely to be fully doable with the kinds of data we work with. But this is one of the places where, as Jay suggested, aligning systematic quantitative data with stories and more bespoke studies of particular cases may offer the best of both worlds for outreach and planning.
The only thing that I would add to that is in the stories category is most places, most universities that we've spoken with, undergraduates were not allowed in research labs in the spring and in the summer. To some extent, that was a PPE issue. You know, it was a limited supply. Many of the universities are now allowing those students back into the laboratories, but it's a gradual process at most places as they come back.
Yes, we're embroiled. For those of you who closely follow the university news, the University of Michigan is embroiled in a process of figuring out. We just relaxed some restrictions on undergraduate participation in the labs when the county health department made some choices about undergraduate activity in general. And so part of what we hope here, as this suggests, is that if we can get closer to more representative and more real-time data, we can actually start to see when shifts like that happen, and hopefully provide a more up-to-date sense of what's going on in our labs and research teams and campuses, as well as this more aggregate sense of what the pressures facing, if you will, the academic research sector are.
Yeah, related to that, real quick, the sense is that transmission of SARS-CoV-2 is near to zero in research environments. And in fact, many universities have said we don't have any evidence of any of that happening on campus in a research environment. Most folks are saying that transmission in their community occurs off campus.
Yep. And that's consistent with what I've been hearing in my conversations with universities as well. Yeah. And it suggests that we may see more sort of full ramp up of the research side of our various shops as the broader academic and educational side is still facing some uncertainty. But part of the key question is, what is the legacy of this going to be, this being the pandemic and the shutdown, for particularly students, for a pipeline, for our ability to do and pursue effectively research, even when we may have lost, due to salary that was paid out for good reasons when the grants themselves weren't supporting work. We may have lost the capability to do some of the research that's already been funded, and absent some larger program of research relief, it seems very likely that we will either lose some of the progress that has been made on current projects, or in order to maintain it, end up limiting new projects as we move forward out of the pandemic. Both of those, along with significant changes that might result if this is long-term in our educational pipeline, have the potential to really dramatically affect the ways in which the work is done and are standing nationally and as institutions in science around the world.
So your comment there made me think one of the things that would be nice to have data on is I'm pretty sure we're going to see a really steep drop off in travel expenditures.
Yes.
That's fully expected. I wonder if we will see any increase in people attending conferences. Mm-hmm. They're all virtual, and my sense is that you can bring a lot more staff to conferences than you could previously, because you don't have to pay for hotels and and planes. But you know, I don't know if that data are something that you capture or whether there has to be a different mechanism to do that.
It is in principle doable for conferences that are reimbursed from grants, which is many of them. You know, as usual, the devil's in the details. And so different universities track travel expenditures in different ways, but we've done some work in that direction. And it does speak to, I think, another important reason to do this work now and to build out a data set that can be used now for reporting and later for research is to support not just understanding what we need to recover from, but maybe figuring out what we might have learned about how we do science and do research as academic institutions through the course of the pandemic. It's entirely possible and seems even likely that some of the innovations that people have developed to keep their work going could actually improve our standard practices. And we're not going to know that unless we have the ability to identify them and to follow up and do tests later of what's going on.
Another question just came in. If undergraduate researchers were differentially impacted, as the data suggests, is there a data set that this data can be joined to that would give insight into impacts on affordability of undergrad education, i.e. higher loans or drops in enrollment?
It's a great question, and it is one of the things that IRIS is actually built to do, is to facilitate these kinds of data linkages. So it is not yet part of our release data or our reporting, but we have for the last year, for instance, been working with partners at NCSES, at NSF, that's the National Center for Science and Education Statistics, to pilot test, for instance, linking these kinds of data to survey data, like the survey of earned doctorates. We also, in the Census Bureau data, link to information that is restricted federal data about later employment and earnings of people. So it is in principle possible to see how these things change. And for some subset of universities that share a broader amount of student data, how this is related to enrollment in other places. SED in particular might be useful in this regard over time, though not immediately, because it has a standard set of questions about debt, both debt coming into graduate school and debt on graduation from graduate school. And over the next several years, as this rolls out, we'll be able to see what some of the effects are. Whether we'll be able to capture it in advance is an open question.
Yeah, there's been considerable musing about the impact of the pandemic on, in particular, the graduating class that's coming up, and how that will affect their income short-term and lifetime. And certainly from an academic's point of view, the impact that this will have on their ability to pursue PhD level work and maybe graduate work in general. Mm-hmm. My suspicion is you'll be able to capture that. And not sure what we can do to mitigate it at the moment, but you'll capture it.
Yeah, the first step to mitigation, I would argue, is actually establishing the phenomena you're trying to mitigate. Otherwise, you end up with some of the challenges of what one of my colleagues long ago called superstitious learning. The idea that you learn from a small number of cases that two things that you might do are related, but their relatedness is actually spurious. And so you end up sometimes performing magical rituals over and over again to address problems, even though they don't work.
There was a statement just added to the chat, somewhat related. SED added some items asking respondents about the impact of COVID in June. So,
which is great. That
all superstition.
Yep, and that's one of the other things that's happening here. Part of the insight that we're trying to build with this is that if we do our work right in thinking about collecting and cleaning and protecting data like this, they're linkable potentially to lots of sources of information that we might not know we need yet. And the example of fast turnaround survey changes relating to COVID in the SED is a great example of something where work that was done for another purpose, in this case, some training classes we're working on with NCSES, might actually support a new use down the road that could provide some really important insights that we didn't expect when we built the system.
Well, we have 7 minutes left. Apparently no more questions. If anyone wants to add a quick question, now's the time. Otherwise, I thank you all for joining us. And like I said, we'll post the video in a few days on YouTube. And unless anyone wants the final word, I'll just say thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much. And Jay, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on this. It's been really fun.
Jason, it's always a pleasure working with you.
Thank you. This is Jeanette. Will we get a notice when it is posted?
Yes, sure. I can send out a notice.
Thank you.
And Dan, there is a final question.
Oh. Yes. If new members join, will they be able to get back data on COVID impact?
Yes. And I should say, at the risk of too much of a sales job in what was supposed to be a substantive thing, we have recently, with our board of directors, developed some mechanisms to try to streamline and make easier joining IRIS. We're very happy if you're at an institution that might be interested in this to talk with you. Please reach out to me or to IRIS Info and we can tell you more about it. But our goal with this is to produce these reports both in the aggregate and for participating universities as routinely as we can, given data through this process.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you spending some time with us and look forward to hearing more and your thoughts. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have questions or if we can provide you with some more information about what IRIS is and does. Or if you happen to know researchers who might like to work with some of these data for their purposes and to increase our ability to say important things, because we don't believe for a moment that we have a corner on the best ways to use these data. So we want them used analytically to help inform exactly this kind of work. Thanks very much.